Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 302 of the Psych Files. Have you ever wondered, why do some people become violent extremists? I'm going to guess that you have. I know I have. We hear about acts of extreme violence, and we see the people who carry them out appear to think that they are on the right side, that their behavior is justified, despite the fact that we see their behavior as despicable. So how does it happen? How does someone turn their lives in the direction of violent extremism? And, of course, what can we do? How can we help those people turn themselves away from that kind of a life? So there has been some really good research on this, and haven't touched upon it yet in the podcast, so I thought this would be the time. So I want to talk to you about a very interesting model that has come out that I think explains a lot of how people become vulnerable to becoming extremists. So we're going to tackle that today. All right, so I'm going to be kind of walking you through an article, and it's called The Making of Violent Extremists in the Journal Review of General Psychology. Got a bunch of authors here: Ari Kruglansky, Katarzyna Jasko, David Weber, Marina Chernikova, and Erica Molinario. And they're from 4 different universities. So they put their brains together on this really fine article. They have a model, which they sometimes refer to as SQT, Significance Quest Theory, which identifies 3 key factors that will lead someone to become a member of an extremist group. So again, this is the Psych File, so we're looking at the issue of extremism from a psychological perspective. You'll get perspectives on extremism from sociologists and those involved in politics, but we are going to dive into the human brain here. My first really interesting quote from this article is this: "The underlying force to which we attribute the appeal of extreme behavior is the basic human desire to matter and to have meaning in one's life. We refer to this as the quest for personal significance." Now, you have no doubt heard about other need-based theories, the most famous of which, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in addition to the safety needs, had self-esteem, self-actualization. When I talk to students about this hierarchy, is that it's not necessarily that you work on one need until it's completely filled and then you move on to the next need. We, in our lives, will go back and forth among these needs. You could be, let's say, on one of the higher levels of the hierarchy. You are working on your self-esteem needs. You're working on becoming really good at your jobs. That's the sort of thing that makes you feel good about yourself. But then you lose your job, and now you're concerned just about basic survival needs. So we move among those needs. And one of the things they point out here is that in some cases, this need for personal significance outweighs the others. There's what they call a triggering event that makes people feel so badly about themselves that it threatens their sense of importance in life. The need to overcome that is more powerful than any other need for food or sex or survival. They need to restore themselves to a sense that they're important. They refer to that as a motivational imbalance. And extremism, quote again, is a consequence of motivational imbalance, the tendency of individuals to privilege one need at the expense of others. Okay, that again being this need for significance. So this SQT, Significance Quest Theory, this model, the 3 ingredients that lead someone to become, or lead them into extremism, are this need I just mentioned, but also you could have this overwhelming need, and we'll talk a second about what causes that need to become so strong. But you also have to have 2 other components, what they refer to as the narrative and the network. And as I say, there's excellent research behind this. I don't know if we'll get to it in this episode, but I want to, if not, then I want to devote another episode to some of the research that has supported this theory. It's really quite interesting. Okay, so this need, quote again, "All individuals have a fundamental desire to matter, to merit respect, and to be someone." And my comment on this is that there are so many other places where you see this happen. I've talked before about the self-esteem bias. We like to attribute our successes to ourselves, to our personalities. It makes us feel good about ourselves. And we like to attribute our failures to other people, right? So we blame others when we don't do well in life. Blaming the victim is another sort of element of this. You don't want to think that things are chaotic. You want to believe that you're in control of your life and that you are successful because of you. And if other people, it makes you uncomfortable that other people have not done so well, that they are victims. And so sometimes we just, in order to protect ourselves, we look for reasons why that person is responsible for that. It would never happen to me. So chaos is not something we deal well with. Think about the times that you and others just like to think that, hey, my life is, I've done okay. I'm important. Think about the times when you've either felt shame or humiliation. Those are the times when your sense of self is so crushed that is an awful feeling. And you really want to recover from that as soon as you can. Okay, so what are some of these triggers? The article here refers to perhaps a person could fail at an important life pursuit. So that's personal. But remember how important our connection to groups is. In fact, I've referred to that often as the social identity. And there are somewhat weak social identities, such as, your favorite baseball team. You feel good when they win, not so good when they lose. So that's a social identity. But some of our social identities are stronger than that. Most of us listening to this podcast, we can't quite identify with someone whose social group has been disparaged. Right? We can identify with humiliation. We know how bad that feels. It's happened to us at some point in our lives. But what if you did belong, what if you're from another country and you belong to a religious group that was being persecuted? Even in our own country, I can only imagine what it's like to be a young black male and to live in an area where young black men are being shot and killed. You have to imagine that when yet another event like that occurs, what do the young black men and women, what do they think? What do they feel about how they are being treated in this country? Quote here from the article. Sometimes the quest for significance is not induced by a single traumatic experience. Rather, it may build over time and be induced by an accumulation of small realizations that a person or their group have been subjected to systemic discrimination and abuse. Now, of course, other minority groups could also have this feeling. The article here mentions Muslims in general. How are they looked at and treated by the majority in the culture? When it becomes grossly unfair, and as they say here, systemic, continued, then we are setting the seeds for putting those people into a state where they feel such a sense of loss that they start looking for ways, some of them start looking for ways to replace that sense of loss. So I'll leave, of course, a link to the article, a citation of it on my website. Okay, so as they say, this activation of the significance quest is only the first step in a process that leads one to the extreme. So what then causes an individual to identify violent extremism as the route towards earning meaning in life? So why turn to violent extremism? That's where ingredient 2 comes into play, what they refer to as the narrative. Imagine you've got a group of people who feel that they themselves, or a group to which they strongly identify. In the U.S., people don't strongly identify with a lot of things. We're not a terribly religious people overall. And that's partly because we're not fighting in the streets over food, right? Things are pretty good here. So we can often be a kind of a live and let live kind of thing, but it's not that way in other countries. Okay, so you are a young person, probably male. In order for you to get on that road toward extremism, you have to be exposed to what they refer to as a narrative. In other words, there has to be somewhere, be it online or in person, people who are telling a story about how unjust this current situation is and how violence is the answer to that. So they call it the narrative. It's a story that you have to be exposed to. The narrative, quote again, justifies violence as an effective way to attain significance and presents it as moral and acceptable. Thus, under a heightened need for significance, an individual may be particularly sensitive to meaning frameworks that are explicit about significance affording causes that directly promise a sense of mattering and purpose to those who subscribe to them. In short, the role of the narrative is to pinpoint a preferred course of action from among several possible options, and to legitimize that course as the best method for addressing an individual's aroused need for significance. This would mean exposure to these quote-unquote narratives online or in person. Okay, so then what's the third ingredient? You've got a person who feels a sense of loss of personal significance, who has been exposed to a philosophy, if you will, a creed that explains how it happened. This could even be a conspiracy theory type thing. It explains why the person is in this situation and then justifies violence as the way to rectify the situation. The third ingredient then is what they call the network. So now you're talking about a group of people who strongly advocate this narrative. And, quote, contact with such a network makes violence a justifying narrative. And, quote, the network's support for the narrative validates it and serves as proof of its veracity and soundness. So it's one thing to read about something online, to get some books, to get this sense that, well, maybe this awful state that I'm in that I want to get out of, I have a need for, they refer to it as a need for closure. I got to get out of this awful situation. You've read some literature, seen some posters that's leading you down this direction. Now you've got to actually come in contact with people, and these people have such a certainty about this course of action that it makes you believe that this really is what's going on. They, quote, validate the notion that violent means are an appropriate method of attaining individual and group goals. And these could also be family members or close friends who believe that violence, quote, is not only acceptable, but even commendable. And so they conclude with this statement. Individuals who both experience a quest for significance and are embedded in a social network that subscribes to a violence-justifying narrative will be more likely to engage in violent extremism than individuals who experience only one or neither of those two. Okay, what are some nuances to this three-part model? They talk about a few things. Some people will move more rapidly in this direction, and they refer to that as persuadability. And so those who are more easily persuaded would be more likely to move down this track. Those who are conformists, quote, may be particularly impacted by the consensual views of their fellow members, right? People who really need to be a part of a group. Individuals who are, as they say, rejection sensitive, and those who come from an honor culture. And that, again, may not be something that we Americans can easily identify with, an honor culture. Okay, so only a little of the research that they've conducted on this. Here's a study I thought was interesting. A study that looked at 219 successful suicide bombers, and this was led by one of the authors, Weber. Now, what they did was take a look at what they call archival data. In other words, anything that exists that these people have disclosed about themselves. Could be stuff that they've written, stuff they've put online, personal data about their lives. If we examine their lives, do we see any incidences that we might refer to as inducing a loss of significance, such as, again, personal failure, death of a family member, divorce, infertility? And what they found? Quote, the findings revealed that the more evidence there was for an attacker's significance quest motive, the greater the effectiveness of their attack. In concrete terms, attackers who exhibited greater significance quest killed and wounded more people. So more of those events in your life, the greater the violence. Another study, quote, examine the relationship between significance loss and engagement in political violence in the United States. They looked at a number of directions of extremism, which included far right, that is white nationalist, far left, that is anti-capitalist, and the main outcome, again, quote, the main outcome variable was whether the illegal act the person committed in service of the ideology was violent, such as planting bombs or trying to assassinate political leaders. So they looked at a sample of nearly 1,500 political extremists and found that these individuals were more likely to resort to violence to pursue their ideological goals when they had experienced failures at work and when they had problems in social relationships. The article also mentions the terrorist group ISIS, and they mention that at its peak, quote, ISIS managed to attract thousands of foreign fighters from around the world. Now here they rely on what they refer to as anecdotal stories as well as systematic empirical evidence, which points to, quote, a similar set of predictors of joining the battlefield in the conflict. Interviews with ISIS volunteers frequently mention their desire to escape rejection and alienation and to find meaning. What they're looking for is, as they quote here, a need for cognitive closure. Individuals who've experienced these losses, whether they be personal losses or losses for their group, have a heightened desire for clear-cut and unambiguous answers. Another point they make, when investigators analyzed, quote, this is a quote here, the recruitment patterns of ISIS foreign fighters, they identified peer-to-peer networks and simply knowing someone who had already joined ISIS as the most influential factors in radicalization. Roughly 90% of those interviewed found their way into the movement through close social connections. Most often the connections consisted of friends or schoolmates. Another psychological concept we've talked about before here on the show is group polarization, which happens when if you get a few people, say 4 or 5 people together who hold a roughly same view on something, and if you let them discuss their views, they'll become even more extreme in their views. Just getting those people together and letting them talk tends to make us, wherever we might initially be, in favor, against, even more so afterwards. So that's the network ingredient. Now, as far as why violence, this is interesting. I didn't know this. They've looked at some research that showed that the success rate, quote, for violent campaigns was only 26%. Nonviolent campaigns were successful 53% of the time. So it actually, and this is good to know, nonviolent approaches to change are more successful than violent ones. Because, quote, violence may be counterproductive towards winning popular support for a cause. Right? Understandable. So why violence? Why often violence? Quote, one reason violence can be attractive to individuals searching for significance is that it sends an unambiguous message about the importance of a cause. Violence draws attention to a cause. Nonviolent protests often go unnoticed, but ones that turn violent garner attention from the media and the authorities. Thus, violent actions are almost sure to make one feel noticed and agentic. Also, the use of violence communicates a strong commitment to one's values, and in this way, it's significance enhancing. I mean, they don't mention here, but I think I would throw in there that we glorify violence. It's in our movies. It's the way we solve problems in this world. Almost every movie, particularly action movies, could be resolved if the main protagonists sat down and talked things through. But that doesn't happen for one reason or another, of course. It has to be resolved through some form of violence. So violence is seen as the